Brother Phil Capusta will be giving us words this morning to encourage us, to strengthen us. His title is Innocent as Doves. In preparation for his remarks, he asked that we read 1 Kings chapter 21, verse 1 through 19. 1 Kings 21, verses 1 through 19. Now Naboth the Jezreelite had a vineyard in Jezreel, beside the palace of Ahab, king of Samaria. And after this, Ahab said to Naboth, "Give me your vineyard, that I may have it for a vegetable garden, because it is near my house, and I will give you a better vineyard for it. Or if it seems good to you, I will give you its value in money." But Naboth said to Ahab, "The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers." And Ahab went into his house, vexed and sullen because of what Naboth the Jezreelite had said to him. For he had said, "I will not give you the inheritance of my fathers." And he lay down on his bed and turned away his face and would eat no food. But Jezebel, his wife, came to him and said to him, "Why is your spirit so vexed that you eat no food?" And he said to her, "Because I spoke to Naboth the Jezreelite and said to him, 'Give me your vineyard for money, or else if it please you, I will give you another vineyard for it.' And he answered, 'I will not give you my vineyard.' And Jezebel, his wife, said to him, 'Do you now govern Israel? Arise and eat bread and let your heart be cheerful. I will give you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite.' So she wrote letters in Ahab's name and sealed them with his seal. And she sent the letters to the elders and leaders who lived with Naboth in his city. And she wrote in the letters, 'Proclaim a fast and set Naboth as the head of the people, and set two worthless men opposite him, and let them bring a charge against him, saying, "You have cursed God and the king." Then take him out and stone him to death." And the men of his city, the elders and the leaders who lived in his city, did as Jezebel had sent word to them. As it was written in the letters that she had sent to them, they proclaimed a fast and set Naboth as the head of the people. And the two worthless men came in and sat opposite him. And the worthless men brought a charge against Naboth in the presence of the people, saying, "Naboth cursed God and the king." So they took him outside the city and stoned him to death with stones. Then they sent to Jezebel, saying, "Naboth has been stoned. He is dead." As soon as Jezebel heard that Naboth had been stoned and he was dead, Jezebel said to Ahab, "Arise, take possession of the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite, which he refused to give you for money, for Naboth is not alive, but dead." And as soon as Ahab heard that Naboth was dead, Ahab arose to go down to the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite to take possession of it. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite, saying, "Arise, go down to meet Ahab, king of Israel, who is in Samaria. Behold, he is in the vineyard of Naboth, where he has gone to take possession. And you shall say to him, 'Thus says the Lord, have you killed and also taken possession?' And you shall say to him, 'Thus says the Lord, in the place where dogs licked up blood of Naboth, shall dogs lick your own blood.'" With that, I'll turn it over to Phil.
Okay, I think we have everything in order. Good morning, first of all, to everyone. Glad you're able to make it out on this wet morning. I wish our highways looked like the one up above us. Coming down from Fredericksburg, it was nothing like this. This is actually a Google Street View of an overpass, a bridge overpass, just north of Flint, Michigan. And this is Interstate 75. And it was on this bridge back in the year 2017, on the 18th of October, that 5 teenage boys decided to do something that would greatly affect their lives and the lives of others. Switch now to PowerPoint. All right, these are the 5 boys in question. These actually were teenagers. They were all teenagers. They were between the ages of 14 and 17 at the time. And they decided to have what they would call later fun, to see who could hit the most number of vehicles on the interstate below. They would drop stones to see if they could hit the vehicle, and the one who hit the most vehicles would somehow win some, I don't know, who knows what it was. What happened would have been much different had these stones been perhaps gravel-sized pebbles, but they were not. The stones that these boys chose to toss over the bridge weighed as heavy as much as 20 pounds. One of the stones, weighing 6 pounds, hit the windshield of a passing van that was traveling southbound on 75. And as you can see here, the stone shattered the windshield on the passenger side and struck the passenger directly in the head. Once the boys saw what happened, they jumped into a pickup truck that one of them had parked on the side of the bridge, and they fled the scene. The victim, who is seen here in the top right corner of the slide, he was a 34-year-old father, and he was on his way home from a day at work, and unfortunately he died shortly thereafter. The pickup truck that the boys fled in was reported to the police, and it didn't take long for them to identify the culprits and apprehend them. They were all charged by the police with second-degree murder. One of the boys, the oldest one, later pled guilty to the charges, confessing that he was the one who dropped the rock that killed the passenger. The other 4 boys tried to strike a plea deal, which was later withdrawn. Today, they're still waiting a trial, that is the 4, on the original charges of second-degree murder. Now, what's interesting about this very tragic event is that despite the fact that there was only 1 stone and 1 victim, all 5 boys were charged with the same crime, second-degree murder. Now, how can all 5 boys be charged with the same crime of murder when only one of the boys dropped the rock that killed the man? Well, according to most state laws, you don't have to pull the trigger, or in this case, you don't have to drop the rock that kills the victim to be convicted of second-degree murder. You simply have to show disregard for life, which all of these boys did. One particular legal concept that is relevant to this situation is complicity. Complicity is when a person contributes in some way to the perpetration of a crime committed by another person. Under Minnesota law, I realize this was done in Michigan, but this was one of the statutes that I came across first in my search. Under Minnesota law, complicity It's actually defined by law. There's a complicity statute. And it's defined as a person is criminally liable for a crime committed by another if the person intentionally aids, advises, hires, counsels, or conspires with, or otherwise procures the other to commit the crime. Now, I'm not up here this morning to teach you the intricacies of criminal law, but I do want to bring to your attention this concept of complicity. And by the time I get to the end of this talk, you'll understand why. But for now, just try to follow me, and I'm going to try to make it a little simpler by putting up a simpler definition. Maybe it will help. This comes from Merriam-Webster's, and complicity there is defined as the association or participation in a wrongful act committed by another. The act in question may be immoral, or the act may be illegal, but in either case, a complicit individual is one who is in some way associated with somebody else's wrongful act. Often such complicit individuals are called accomplices. So with those basics, I'm going to move into the Bible, and I'm going to provide you some examples to help make sense of what I am talking about. In the Bible, we find several instances of individuals complicit in wrongful acts committed or carried out, I should say, by others. Now, one example that easily comes to mind is King David. Now, after David's affair with Bathsheba and her message to him reached him that she was pregnant, David arranged for her husband to return home to her. But despite repeated efforts, that scheme failed. So David resorted to what we'd call Plan B, which we find in 2 Samuel chapter 11, starting at verse 14, which reads, "In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In it he wrote, 'Put Uriah in the front line where the fighting is fiercest. Then withdraw from him so he will be struck down and die.'" And Joab, David's general, did just as David instructed. Uriah was consequently killed in battle. So I'm going to ask you a question. Who killed Uriah? Was it the enemy against whom David's army came up against? Did they kill Uriah? Yes, of course they did. But who saw to it that Uriah was intentionally abandoned in the heat of battle? It was Joab. But who ultimately was to blame for this whole scheme? Who instructed Joab to abandon Uriah? It was David. This makes David complicit in the death of Uriah. And this is because, applying our definition of complicity, David participated in a wrongful act which was ultimately completed by another individual. In the same chapter, we find this response. The thing that David had done displeased the Lord. And then in the next chapter, we find God's judgment coming down hard on David as a result of his complicity in Uriah's death. So 2 Samuel 12, verses 9 through 10, coming through the word of the prophet, "Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now, therefore, the sword will never depart from your house, because you despise me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. Notice how, in God's eyes, David is described as the one who killed Uriah with the sword, even though it was the sword of the Ammonites that struck the fatal blow to Uriah. This is how complicity works. This is why there are 4 teenagers on trial for second-degree murder in Michigan, even though it was the 5th boy who dropped the fatal rock. In both examples, there existed an association between the complicit individuals and the fatal act, even though the complicit individuals did not commit the ultimate act. Now, moving on to a second example from the Bible, I'd like to direct our attention to the passage that our brother read for us from 1 Kings 21 this morning. And I want to continue on this theme of complicity. And to refresh our memories, King Ahab wanted a vineyard that was owned by an individual named Naboth. Now, Naboth, he was approached by the king with an offer to purchase the vineyard, but he declined. The king then became depressed because he could not get what he wanted. Next, in walks his wife Jezebel, who takes matters into her own hands and plots a scheme to have Naboth killed on false charges, actually, blasphemy. After Naboth is killed, interestingly, he is stoned, and they actually didn't make that connection until now. After Naboth is killed, Jezebel informs Ahab, and Ahab becomes the new owner of the vineyard. So let me now ask a second question. In this narrative, who killed Naboth? If we turn back to 1 Kings 21 and we pick up the story in verse 18, we'll see. And we'll find something here I believe is very interesting pertaining to this question of who killed Naboth. And it should expand our understanding of complicity. So starting in verse 18, go down to meet Ahab, king of Israel, who rules in Samaria. He is now in Naboth's vineyard, where he has gone to take possession of it. Say to him, this is what the Lord says. Have you not murdered a man and seized his property? Then say to him, this is what the Lord says. In the place where dogs licked up Naboth's blood, dogs will lick up your blood. Yes, yours. So in this continuation of the narrative, in the eyes of God, who murdered Naboth? According to Elijah, Ahab is accused of murdering Naboth. In fact, God declares that Ahab's own blood would soon be shed on account of his involvement in the shedding of Naboth's blood. And yet, what's so interesting about all this is that, according to the biblical narrative, Ahab never threw a stone at Naboth, nor did he plot Naboth's death. According to 1 Kings 21, all that Ahab did was desire Naboth's vineyard, and then mention to his wife Jezebel how Naboth had rejected his offer. And yet, in God's eyes, that's enough to make Ahab complicit in another man's death. So, to summarize, Ahab's discontent started a chain of events culminating in a man's death for which Ahab is ultimately held responsible. I want this to sink in. You do not need to drop a rock or throw a stone or pull a trigger to have blood on your hands in the eyes of God. And I'm going to repeat myself. You do not need to drop a rock or throw a stone or pull a trigger to have blood on your hands in the eyes of God. A person can be several steps removed from a man's death and still have blood on their hands, just as Ahab had. So, does any of what I have said so far have any relevance for us? Why am I spending so much time on this subject of complicity? Well, I believe this topic is relevant to us. And I believe that you and I are on a regular basis tempted with, we are on a regular basis tempted where we could too have another person's blood on our hands. Now, how can this be? How could we be put in such a position? Well, actually, it's quite easy. All we have to do is become active participants in a representative government. And every 2 or 4 years, the citizens of this country are given such an opportunity. In fact, we're only 2 days away from such an opportunity. Now, what am I talking about? What I'm talking about is that on Tuesday, this nation will hold a national election along with local state elections, in which Americans will choose individuals who they wish to have represent them in our national and state governments. Now, what does that have to do with us possibly becoming complicit in evil? Well, there's something that is so easy to forget when a person casts a vote for a politician seeking high office. When electing presidents, governors, and representatives at the state and national level, it should be remembered that part of the duties of these offices sometimes include the authorization of the use of violence. When a person votes to place another person in the office of president, let's say, for instance, this office, like all other offices, comes with a job description. When it comes to the office of the president, that role includes serving as commander-in-chief of the armed forces. When a person votes for a president, they decide to give one person control over the deadliest weapon in the world, the U.S. military. And by their vote, authorize him or her to use the military whenever they feel necessary. Moreover, in the United States, the president also has the power to authorize the sale of military weapons to other countries. The U.S. has the dubious distinction of being the world's leading dealer in military weaponry, fueling some of the world's most devastating conflicts. I'll give you an example of the magnitude of this. In fiscal 2019, the U.S. sold $68 billion worth of military weapons to 28 countries. And it would be naive to think that these weapons never ended up killing innocent men, women, and children. And the case is, unfortunately, now that collateral damage in military conflicts has become the norm, not the exception. But let's get back to the topic of voting. One must consider that a vote not only signifies an endorsement of a candidate, but also an endorsement of the duties and job functions of the office which the candidate is seeking. Those who vote in such elections are affirming that they want a particular office to be filled with their representative. It's remarkable that you rarely hear anyone talk about this reality, what goes on behind the scene, and the connection between the face and the office. But the fact is, this is what a person does when they vote a candidate into office in a political contest. Therefore, perhaps we should start looking at political elections from a different perspective. Instead of looking at the candidate's character, their past experience, their campaign promises, their party platforms, etc., what if we look primarily at the office that he or she is seeking? Now, if we were to do that, what we would find is that some of the duties and responsibilities of high political office, such as for president or for a member of Congress, include the following: the creation of new laws which imprison people and may lead to their execution, the leading of armed forces in times of war, the approval of torture, the declaration of war and the funding of wars, the approval of targeted killings through the use of unmanned aerial drones, and the authorization of taxpayer dollars to fund abortions. In light of these realities, we should ask ourselves the hard question: can we keep our hands clean and free from the shedding of innocent blood if we participate in voting men and women into these positions of power and give them our permission to perform such actions and enact related policies? I would suggest to you that it is not possible to separate one's vote for a candidate from the job functions that the candidate must perform. What I've gone over during the past 15 minutes is just one of the many reasons why our religious community has abstained from not only serving in positions of political power, but also from voting. Now, I could spend, and this is not an exaggeration, I could spend hours up here listing off more than a dozen other reasons why followers of Jesus should not be politically active. But for the sake of time, I have chosen to focus on this matter of complicity this morning. Now, why is this topic so important? Jesus in Matthew 10, verse 16, said to his disciples, "I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves. Be therefore wise as serpents and harmless as doves." Most modern versions have here innocent as doves in contrast to the King James, harmless as doves. If we as Jesus' followers are supposed to be harmless and innocent as doves, should we not take seriously this matter of complicity when it comes to our involvement in the political process? This matter of being complicit in the shedding of innocent blood is not just theoretical, but rather it's real. And I'll give you an example. If we go back in time to the year 2004, President George W. Bush was then running for re-election. His opponent was Democrat Senator John Kerry. During the re-election campaign, President Bush made it very clear that he would continue to support the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan if he was re-elected. During the presidential debates, President Bush once said, quote, "You cannot lead the war on terror if you keep changing positions on the war. We will continue to stay on the offense," unquote. Senator Kerry, interestingly, was just as pro-war as the president, for he Senator Kerry responded, quote, "I believe we can be successful. I'm not talking about leaving Iraq. I'm talking about winning. I'm going to lead those troops to victory," unquote. So in this particular example, voting for either candidate was a vote to continue both wars. It's worth noting that according to one 2018 study, these quote-unquote wars on terror killed over 200,000 non-combatant civilians. In addition to those killed by direct acts of violence, the number of indirect deaths, that is, those resulting from disease, displacement, and the loss of critical infrastructure, the number of indirect deaths is believed to be several times higher, running into the millions. In this example, knowing in advance that both presidential candidates had promised to maintain the wars, could a disciple of Jesus have cast a vote for either presidential candidate and claim that his or her hands were not in some way stained with blood in retrospect? When a person casts a vote for a candidate who is running on a platform that includes the continuation of two wars, how can that person not be responsible in some way for the resulting bloodshed? Perhaps someone might dismiss such a possibility or reject any responsibility by claiming, well, I wasn't aware that the wars were going to be so messy and deadly when I voted for these candidates. Moreover, I didn't kill these people over there, so just don't lay that guilt trip on me. Well, in response, could not King Ahab have answered the prophet Elijah in a similar way? Could he not have said, "Hey, Elijah, I did not kill Naboth, so don't lay that guilt trip on me. I didn't realize things were going to get so messy when I told my wife how unhappy I was about Naboth. I only wanted a change of scenery. I didn't know that my wife was going to devise a plan to kill Naboth on my behalf using her volunteer soldiers." God didn't buy it, did he? In fact, through the prophet Elijah, God called Ahab a murderer. Here's another reason why voting is not appropriate for a follower of Jesus. Consider this scenario that is not implausible. Let's imagine a conversation between a Christian and an unbelieving neighbor, or perhaps between a Christian and a non-Christian coworker or an unbelieving family member. Now, let's say that these unbelievers have very strong political views, and that shortly after an election, they ask the Christian, "So, who did you vote for?" At this point, the Christian has a 50% chance of making each one of these unbelievers angry or disgusted on account of the fact that the Christian voted against their candidate. Actually, it doesn't even matter whether the Christian voted for the same candidate as the unbeliever did, or whether the Christian voted against their candidate. In either case, there is one thing that is for certain. This hypothetical Christian just lost an opportunity to share the Christian faith with that unbeliever, all because they exercised the right to vote rather than abstain from the political process. Had this Christian not voted for candidate A or for candidate B, they could have instead explained the rationale behind their abstention, which would have been an opportunity to share with the unbeliever that they were a follower of Jesus. And as such, participating in political elections raises numerous moral dilemmas for them. And that is the reason why they chose not to vote. If the unbeliever asks, "What dilemmas?" well, the Christian could then bring up the matter of complicity, for example, and how Jesus instructed his followers to be harmless and innocent as doves, and how both candidates were pro-war. Or the Christian could explain how participating in the political process forces a Christian to make compromises, often supporting the lesser of two evils, despite the Apostle Paul stating that Christians should abstain from all appearance of evil. So my point is, what does such political entanglements do to our witness as heralds of the gospel of Jesus? Paul also tells us that we are to be blameless and harmless, the sons of God without rebuke, in the midst of a crooked and perverse nation, among whom ye shine as lights in the world. Would voting in political elections help us maintain our blamelessness and our standing as harmless and innocent doves in the eyes of the world? Or would we risk bringing contempt on the cause of Jesus and his message through our political allegiances and actions? I personally would prefer to have an unbeliever mad at me for not voting than to have them think that I am their enemy or their opponent for choosing a political party which they strongly disagree with. Since we are on the subject of what the world thinks of Christians who are politically active, let me now mention one other reason why a follower of Jesus should not exercise the right to vote. This reason has to do with conscientious objection to war. It is a historic fact that participating in the electoral system has been viewed as a reason for military draft committees to reject a person's request for conscientious objection from war. The logic is pretty simple. How can a person, assuming that person's a conscientious objector to war, how can one refuse to participate in a war which perhaps results from the actions of their vote? How can one claim to be a conscientious objector while voting for a person who has the right and obligation to declare war? Governments and military draft review boards have historically seen the inconsistency. Such inconsistency explains why men were disqualified as conscientious objectors when it was learned that they had voted in government elections. Such an obvious inconsistency in position provides evidence of non-sincerity on the part of the applicant, and hence their CO application or exemption is denied. Today, it is not uncommon to hear mainstream religious leaders declare that it is a Christian duty to vote. And some even go as far to say that it is a sin not to vote. But I think it is a much easier case to make, that one is more likely to commit a sin through complicity when voting than by abstaining from voting. Here's an example. I'm going to simulate an election. Now, I don't know, Walter, if you can get feedback or whether people online want to voice their feedback, but I'm going to have a mock election here. We're going to vote for a candidate for a high political office, and we're going to have three candidates available. We're going to call them Candidate A, Candidate B, and Candidate C. And I'm going to give you some background about the three candidates, okay? So listen up. Everyone online, you're free to vote. You can do A, B, and C. Walter, you'll have to be counting the votes back there. And everyone here, I expect you to raise your hand. So I want you to pay attention. Candidate A. All right. He associates with crooked politicians and consults with astrologers. He's had 2 mistresses. He also smokes constantly, plays cards every chance he gets, and drinks 8 to 10 martinis a day. That's candidate A. Moving on, candidate B. Candidate B has been kicked out of office twice. He sleeps until noon, takes leisurely baths lasting for hours. He used opium in college, and he drinks a quart of whiskey every evening. Candidate B. Moving on, candidate C. Candidate C is a decorated war hero. He's a vegetarian. He does not smoke. He drinks only an occasional beer, and he's extremely kind to children and to dogs. Now, which of these 3 candidates would you vote for as a national leader? Now, I'm going to flip through these again. All right, so here's candidate A. Here's candidate B. Here's candidate C, all right? So those online, if you haven't started, let Walter know through some hook or crook. As he's tallying the votes, I'm going to take the votes here in person. So candidate A, raise your hand if you would vote for candidate A. Okay, well, this is real easy. I got 0 votes. Okay. Oh, I got 1. I got 1. Okay, 1 vote for candidate A. All right, that should be easy enough to remember. Candidate B. Any votes for candidate B? Okay, we got 1. We got 2. I don't know if you're just simply bucking the 3. All right, so we got 3 for candidate B. All right. Well, unless you're all going to abstain, all right, I think I know what the result's going to be. Candidate C, hands up for candidate C. Got 1, 2, 3. I'm getting a lot of abstentions. 4. Connie, are you undecided? Okay, let's pretend it's Australia. It's mandatory. You have to vote, okay? All right. Walter, do we get any responses?
Yeah, 1 for C.
1 for C. Well, I just said, okay, we're supposed to pretend. Okay, we can't do that. We can't pretend. Yeah. Okay. All right, well, I think we got enough votes where we can declare candidate C as the victor, okay? Anyone want to recount? No? All right, well, let's go through these again. But this time I want to take the masks off the candidates. Candidate A is Franklin D. Roosevelt. Candidate B is Winston Churchill. Anyone want to guess who candidate C is? You must have seen me do this in a past life. Candidate C is Adolf Hitler. For those who do not realize it, Hitler was appointed as German Chancellor in 1933 after receiving over 11 million votes by the German people the year before. Now, the point of this mock election is to illustrate that very often people do not have a clue who they are electing as their leader. And most importantly, they often have no idea what evils may come to pass once their newly elected leader is placed into power. Even candidates of seemingly good character can, in actuality, be deeply disturbed and immoral people. True, not all political leaders are on a par with Hitler, but it doesn't take a Hitler to enact policies that lead to evil outcomes. Take, for example, Pontius Pilate. He was no Hitler, and yet let us consider the evil he facilitated when a group of Jewish religious leaders brought before him one day a man from Galilee who was accused of crimes against the state. The charges were, this man is claiming to be a king, and there can only be one king, that is Caesar. In this case, Pilate was, we could say, in a pickle, for it was pointed out to him that you are no friend of Caesar if you don't sentence this man to death for treason, paraphrasing essentially the religious leader's sentiment. Pilate, after questioning the man, found the charges against him exaggerated. It seemed clear to Pilate that the religious leaders were jealous of this man's popularity, perceiving him to be a threat to their position in society, and therefore they orchestrated the whole affair in order to get rid of him. The religious leaders hoped that the Romans, in this case Pontius Pilate, would do the dirty deed of executing this rival and pestilent fellow for them, similar to David's hope that his enemies would eliminate Bathsheba's husband for him. When Pilate recognized that the accused was an innocent man, Pilate attempted to release him. Of course, here the man I'm speaking of is Jesus, and we can read about this account in Matthew 27, starting at verse 19. While Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him this message: "Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him." But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus executed. "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" asked the governor. "Barabbas," they answered. "What shall I do then with Jesus, who is called Christ?" Pilate asked. They all answered, "Crucify him." "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." Pilate, who was serving as an agent of the people in this narrative, he had little choice but to comply. He was bound by his office and by his word to carry out the will of the majority. Yet Pilate recognized the injustice of what they were demanding. When Pilate saw that he could not prevail at all, but rather that a tumult was rising, he took water, washed his hands before the multitude, saying, "I am innocent of the blood of this just person. You see to it." And the people answered and said, "His blood be on us and on our children." In acting in accord with the will of the majority, Pilate recognized that he would soon incur the blood guilt of an innocent man. For this reason, he called for a basin, washed his hands before the people, hoping to distance himself from what was about to happen next. He recognized that he was being used by the Jews, and the Jews knew it too. But neither Pilate nor the Jewish religious leaders, nor the mob who voted with their shouts to crucify him, none of them could wash their hands from the fact that they were soon to be complicit in the shedding of the blood of an innocent person. "Let his blood be on us and on our children," they yelled, assuring Pilate that they would take full responsibility for their choice. And so Pilate, released Barabbas to them, and when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. As tragic as their decision was, these first-century Jews deserve at least some credit. Though they voted to have Barabbas released and Jesus crucified, they at least took responsibility for their votes. This is more than can be said for the majority of Christians who cast their votes year after year for the Pilates and for the Caesars of this age, and yet who afterwards try to wash their hands of their choices, refusing to take any responsibility for the outcome of putting political representatives and agents into office whose job functions have changed very little in 2,000 years. This narrative in Matthew 25 is interestingly the only place in the Bible where anything resembling a political vote takes place. Perhaps it stands as a testimony as to how wrong people can be when it comes to making political choices. Some 2,000 years ago, a majority preferred a robber over God's anointed king. They had no clue what they were doing. Perhaps this is why Jesus said from the cross, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Let not the same be said of us when it comes to our involvement in the affairs of worldly politics. Instead, let us be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Thank you for your attention.
We're going to continue our service by singing together.